So hello and welcome to the latest installment in our ongoing series, PPE in a Time of Pandemic. Now today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by author and journalist Geraldine Brooks, who is presently based at Harvard University. We will be talking about her novel, Year of Wonders. We'll talk about the striking historical case that the novel is based on and about how the experience of writing about a plague bears on Geraldine's thinking about the present pandemic. So today, as I said, I'd love to talk with you about your first novel, which is called Year of Wonders. It's a work of historical fiction set in an English village called Iam. Tell me if I'm saying that right. During the 1660s.
It's actually Iam.
Iam, okay, wonderful. So it's set in an English village called Iam during the 1660s. And I was hoping that we could begin with you talking a little bit about the narrative of the book and the ways in which it charts the historical experience of the village during the plague. So why is the story of Iam so special?
I wasn't really looking to find an idea for a novel at all at the time that I first went to Iam. I was working as the Middle East correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. And, you know, I loved that job, and it was incredibly intense. And there was a rare lull in the breaking news cycle, and I had a few days off, and I thought I would go somewhere that was as different as possible to the hot, dusty places where I did my reporting. So my husband and I went for a hike, or a ramble, as the English call it, in the Peak District. And we'd visited a town called Bakewell, which is aptly famous for its pies. And we were waiting online for a pie when I saw a finger post, a directional sign that said Iam, and underneath it said Plague Village. And not a lot of places try to attract visitors by bragging on being a plague village, but it really intrigued me. So we hiked I think it was about 5 miles north, and found this lovely collection of gritstone cottages clustered around a village green and a beautiful old church. And in the church was set out an account of what had happened there in 1665 when bubonic plague struck. And the villagers took the unique decision to quarantine themselves voluntarily rather than flee, which is what everybody else did. So many people who had means in London had fled the city. And so Im decided to do this great act of self-sacrifice, led by their two religious clerics. And so they arranged to have supplies left at the outskirts of the village. And a year, really, they had no contact, or very little contact at all, no direct contact with the outside world. And it really intrigued me that you could bring a community to a consensus like that. And I wondered what it felt like to be in that claustrophobic situation for a whole year. And it's thought that about 2/3 of the population perished from the plague. So it was a terrible cost that this act of self-sacrifice had. But on the other hand, no outbreak of the plague was ever traced to Iam. So they saved a lot of lives. And I didn't go home that day and run up to my garret and start typing out a novel. I went back to the Middle East and covered the Gulf War, but the story just took root in my imagination. And it sort of sat there, and I thought about it for 10 years before I sat down to write a novel.
Wow, that's a long time. So the book was published in 2001, well before we found ourselves in our present situation. And so I'm kind of interested in why you sat on this story for 10 years. What drew you to returning to it in 2001 and to writing a plague novel?
Well, I didn't sit on it. I didn't even, I wasn't thinking novelist. I was a very busy journalist, and I loved every step I took. I thought it was a huge privilege to bear witness to the consequences of policies that are cooked up in Washington that enact their effects in the lives of ordinary people, thousands and thousands of miles away. So I kept doing that. And And I was doing it all the way into the mid 90s, and I was on an assignment in Nigeria, and I got arrested and thrown in the slammer and accused of being a French spy. And I thought that was really an interesting accusation, because if they had have heard my awful Aussie schoolgirl French, they wouldn't have been under any delusions about my nationality. But anyway, they kept me for a couple of days, and I didn't know how long I'd be there, and I had a lot of time to reflect. And one of the things I reflected on was the fact that I was tick-tock, the biological clock, and I'd forgotten to get pregnant. So when they deported me 3 days later, I went home and greeted my husband with great enthusiasm. And our son was born the following year. And at that point, I didn't really want to be the person in the newsroom that goes on long open-ended assignments to places where you might get thrown in the slammer. So I needed a new gig, and that was when I decided to see if there was something there in this story that I'd been thinking about for so long.
So that's a fascinating origin story. Maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the themes of the book. So one really wonderful theme of the book that struck me when I was reading it, and that resonates in interesting ways with our present situation, is that of the relationship between science and magic. Mm-hmm. So it's in the 1660s. It's this kind of very vivid atmosphere of Puritanism. And at one point, a scientifically minded character is accused of witchcraft by her neighbors. And I was thinking that the experience of the pandemic has, in America at least, tested the faith of the public in science somewhat, and led to the emergence of some very virulent conspiracy theories. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why you wanted to think about the socially mediated relationship of science and magic during this period, and whether your thought on that relationship has bearing on the experiences of our own plague year.
Yeah, so when I was researching the book, I found the time period extremely interesting, this Restoration period. And just if you take that year itself, you have extraordinary juxtapositions. You have Isaac Newton inventing calculus, and you have women still being hanged for witchcraft in Scotland. And you have this sense of the human mind is up for grabs, and it's a contest between superstition and scientific thinking. And I really felt the tension there it's very real at this time, and that makes it a really interesting period, because people are starting to think in very modern ways. Their humor is very recognizable to us. It's it's a big leap from Shakespeare, for sure, in the Tudor period, had a great grasp of human nature, but you don't feel him as a modern man, or at least I don't. You feel that this is something different. But when you start reading the works of the Restoration, everything's been up for grabs for these people. They're deeply cynical because they've lived through so much. They've had a change in religious worship, and then they've had a change back, and they've killed a king and had a second thought about that. And so you can sense the cynical, and there's a kind of a vibe like, oh, the fun bunch is back in town, so let's enjoy life a little bit more. Got rid of those Puritans; they've all gone to America. Great. So that intrigued me. I did not expect to encounter this same rise of superstitious claptrap and just general BS, and that so many people fall for it. I was spending a lot of time getting intensely aggravated reading conspiracy sites, but my head was exploding, so I've had to stop. But people actually buy this. What has happened to the education system that people are not better armed against this kind of thing? So that came as a real shock to me this year. I think one of the most surprising effects of the pandemic was this willingness to throw over science in favor of any old nonsense.
So let's keep talking about the emergence into this kind of like vital restoration period, and in particular a sort of liberalization that takes place and that's really like kind of movingly evoked in the novel. So one of our fellow philosophers, Ben Bramble, has suggested that there's something not quite right about experiencing joy in a year of such incredible sadness for many. So many of us have been, remarkably fortunate during this pandemic. Many of us have been remarkably unfortunate. But those of us who've been fortunate might yet have had joy in some way in our years. And he suggested that maybe there's something that we should feel kind of morally uncomfortable about when we have those positive experiences, that there's something not quite right about having positive sense about yourself and about your life when so many people are suffering so much. And I think one of the lovely things about the Year of Wonders is that it is a year of wonders in your account that admits the terrible loss, the madness, the discord. Strange and beautiful things happen and special relationships form. And all of this in a village that was previously dominated by religious Puritans, by folk possessed by the normative expectation that life should be a joyless affair, even absent a plague. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the moralization of emotions by characters in the novel, first under Puritanism and subsequently during the plague, and the ways in which you envisioned the experience of the plague as having a liberalizing effect on the townspeople and their emotional lives.
The predominant emotion in the book is this overwhelming grief and sense of loss. But as you cope with grief and loss, I think anyone who's experienced it, which we all have, and if, or we will, you also, the corollary is that it strengthens you and you find out things about yourself. And it doesn't mean that you lack empathy for suffering. In fact, I think it expands the capacity for empathy. But you emerge a different person from an experience of intense grief. And I think a community can emerge differently from an experience of intense grief. I think there was a lot more empathy for George Floyd because of the period in which that happened. How many Black men have been killed previously without causing the upswelling of community revulsion? And I think it was partly that we were all stripped a little raw, a little emotionally vulnerable, a little vulnerable in general. Any realistic person knew that this was Russian roulette here. The virus could find anyone, and particularly in the beginning when treatment protocols were very crude, anyone could die of it. So I think that shared experience of fear and grief has led to a kind of an opening of the heart. I hope so. I mean, and also, humans are very resilient. We have to be, because none of us are getting out of this alive, and we know that at some deep level. But if you think about it all the time, then you can't put one foot in front of the other. So I think, it's not that you aren't experiencing grief and sadness, but joy lives next to it. The two travel on parallel tracks, and I think that that's what makes it possible to be humans.
So maybe if we can continue talking about the village of Ayam. So the decision made by the villagers of Ayam is one of great collective virtue. So it's a really extraordinary act of communal solidarity and sacrifice. As you said at the beginning, it probably results in the deaths of up to 2/3 of the village's population. And reflecting on the year that has been, I wondered whether this decision has any corollaries, or whether the experience of Ayam might hold any lessons for us to apply in our current situation.
Yeah, I would put a caveat on that. There was a reason that people didn't flee. These were not people of means, and had they fled, they wouldn't have got a very warm reception if anybody knew where they were coming from. And so there was an idea that, okay, this is going to be bad, but you might face worse if you leave here. So there was that as well. So there was an element of self-protection in staying. And they knew that they would be supplied with food because the local gentry had agreed to that in return for their sacrifice. So, sorry, I lost the thread. Where were we? what was the question?
Well, I was just asking whether, I guess there are any moments in the past year when you've kind of seen things where you're like, oh, this is a similar form of sacrifice, or there's something
Oh yeah,
happening
well,
here
yeah.
that evokes that, or there are some lessons that we should be taking from the decision or from the ways in which solidarity was fostered. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm back on the track now. Yeah, no, I think definitely the carers who put themselves on the line without proper protective equipment, the the young medical students and residents and interns who volunteered for the COVID units, amazing, and lots of individual acts of generosity and self-sacrificing care. That on the other hand, that there was another rising that happened in my own community. We have a very lovely rural community with a lot of summer residents. And there was real resistance to the summer residents wanting to come here for sanctuary, particularly, when New York was a hotspot. And I was like, are you nuts, neighbors? Because obviously it's easier to socially distance in a nice house in the country than it is, living in an apartment building with one elevator. So what are you talking about? But there was a lot of hostility. People who came in those first months with New York plates, got shouted at and, just refused service, and all kinds of ungenerous things happen. So I think that, it can be a mixed picture.
So I guess a personal question, if I may, did writing Year of Wonders in any way prepare you for the experience of living through a pandemic?
Oh no. Yeah, I thought this would all have been over with. I don't know, basing that on what, but I expected this to be a 1 or 2 month, and as somebody whose family lives across the world, it's been quite a difficult thing to suddenly be robbed of the ability to travel, and I didn't realize how much I would miss that, and how strange it would be, how strange it is for modern people of means to be told that you can't go someplace, and that claustrophobia that descends on you when you're not free in that way, and borders are closed to you. That was very unexpected, and no, I mean, I don't think, having written the novel about a time when people didn't have a germ theory of disease, and many people saw disease as vengeance of God, I don't feel that gave particularly useful parallels in that sense.
Well, maybe to follow up on the last question, having now had the experience of living through a pandemic, is there anything that you'd change in your characterization of the village or its experiences if you were writing the novel today?
Actually, I don't think I would, because a lot of what's in the novel follows the line of fact of what happened there as much as we can ascertain it. And there's a lot of debate among historians about what did happen. But it was the best I could do in just following that thread until it frayed, and then trying to make a empathetic leap to, okay, we don't know, but it might have been this. So I don't think I would change the narrative, because I wanted to be faithful to the experience as it was lived there.
So that's interesting, talking about following the line of fact. There's something a little funny about, so the novel's characterized as a work of historical fiction. And I've often thought that there's something a little strange about the term historical fiction.
Yes.
And I love to hear.
My husband, who's a historian, has the same opinion.
Yeah.
He says I went over to the dark side and started making things up.
Right. So, I mean, how important is truth and accuracy in historical fiction? And what are authors being true to precisely? I mean, when you're researching, what do you hold yourself to being true to? Do you see your work as primarily reflective of the past, or is it in some way reflective of the present?
I like to think of historical fiction as the gateway drug to history. That it was for me. I grew up on the novels of Mary Renault, who was a wonderful British writer of the ancient world. And I learned a lot from reading her. it sent me back to the actual history, to find out more about Alexander, and to find out more about Plato, and to find out more about Greek theater and all the things that she wrote about so wonderfully. So she drew me into that, and I hope that, you know, it still works that way for people. I have been known to change the odd fact, but I always fess up to it in the afterwards so that readers can know what the factual basis of the novel is, and where I've made a rare departure just for narrative purposes.
So it's nice noting that you have like this kind of appendix, and it's such a beautifully researched book. And I wondered whether your prior history as a journalist informed your commitment to rendering that set of facts accurately, or do you think that maybe authors who write historical fiction who don't have that background bring different sets of values to bear? So.
Look, there's a lot of discussion among historical novelists about the question of, you know, should you change a fact or not? And there are different opinions, and I respect novelists who approach it both ways. There's also a lot of debate about whether we can really know people of the past. Are we the same or are we different? And, you know, a lot of novelists say, no, it's so different. And I don't buy that. I think in all the most important ways, which are the strong emotions that we share, I don't think people experience love and hate any differently. I don't think they experience fear of death any differently. Obviously, death was more prevalent. They lived with a lot more loss than we have to, and unless you're in one of the ragged edges of the world where there's a tremendous amount of loss still. But I think that the human consciousness it has more constants than it has vast variables. So that's one area where historical novelists might differ. I think, having been a journalist, yes, it does. You know, I'm looking for a good story. I'm looking for what did Mark Twain say? Fiction must be plausible, truth needn't be. So it's these implausible truths, these things that actually happened. Another book of mine that's set in the same time period, but in this country rather than England, is Caleb's Crossing, which is about the first Native American graduate of Harvard. He graduated in 1665, which is an extraordinarily early date for a young man raised in his own language and culture to have learned Latin and Greek and sat down to study with the sons of the colonial elite. And if I made that character up out of whole cloth, it wouldn't be very interesting. But what is interesting is that it actually happened. Well, that's what's interesting to me.
So just another question about the process of researching the book. So I was fascinated to read about the kind of history of AM, and in particular about a practice where in exchange for food, villagers would leave money in small holes outside the village that were filled with vinegar in order to disinfect the money. So commerce kind of continued unimpeded despite historical circumstance. And I wondered like what fact you discovered in the process of your research that surprised you the most?
I think the sparse material lives of people, you know, there was tremendous amount of detail about people's material existence because they all made wills, and in a will in those days you listed everything you owned, and people owned so little. And I think that even though I might have known it intellectually, to actually see this list of the 10 things, 10 material things that were the sum total of the farmer's or the tradesperson's estate. I think that perhaps that was the most surprising. It's been a while now since I did that research, so I can't quite capture what might have surprised me the most. But I think that was one thing.
So here's something that I think a lot of members of our audience will empathize with. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, many people turned to plague fiction to better understand what they were living through, right? So many of us have read your book. We've read Emily St. John Mandel's work, Station 11, Boccaccio, various different things. And it was a kind of interesting movement because we desperately want to eke meaning out of our present situation, but we're totally unfamiliar with the protocols for living during a plague. And so we've turned to authors of fiction for assistance. And so I wondered, as an author of a plague novel, what you've been reading during the pandemic.
Oh, I started off like many people and went to the book I was most guilty about not having read, which was Middlemarch. And I've been reading a tremendous amount of poetry, actually. I think there's something about this time that really calls forth a need to have that kind of distilled emotion of poetry. But I'm just looking. Oh yeah, this is a very good plague book. Lawrence Wright, The End of October. It is so uncanny. He had just finished this book, which is about a COVID pandemic. And I'm happy to report his fictional account is way worse than what we've experienced, but there are a lot. It's a very well-researched novel, and it has a lot of fascinating uses of the factual material about public health and epidemiologists, and it goes to a very interesting, if somewhat dark place.
So, I mean, he's kind of just anticipated the pandemic, as it were, and is probably aware of many of the cultural forces that might condition our response. But I wondered what you think will be the kind of like really salient stories for future authors who want to remember this period. What are some of the striking themes, right? Like in your book, there's this fantastic account of the tension between the emerging modern world, religious absolutism, a past filled with magic. What do you think is characteristic of this moment that will capture the imagination of future novelists?
I'm looking forward to the first really great COVID love story. I think this has been a very hard time for young people. I teach at Harvard, and I twice a week gather my students together in these little tiny Zoom rectangles. And I see those kids who should be having the most social and expansive experience of their life, having to have this incredibly socially impoverished experience instead. And I really, really feel badly for them. But I also believe in human ingenuity, and I'm really dying to learn about how people have transcended this circumstance and found each other nevertheless.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too. So what are you working on now?
I am doing revisions of a novel that's taken me way too long to finish, and it will come out around about this time next year. Touch wood. And it's got a very easy to remember title. It's just called Horse.
Wonderful. Is it about your horse in the?
No, it's a historical novel. Well, it's a braided narrative set in 3 different periods, but the spine of the story is the story of an actually existing racehorse in the 1850s and 60s. And because it was the 1850s and 60s, it's also a story about race, because the people who trained and looked after this horse, almost all of them were Black, incredibly skillful horsemen.
Well, I can't keep you any longer because I know there's been lots of questions coming in from our audience. So I'm going to hand things over to Ryan, and he's going to put those to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Geraldine. So yes, we have a number of questions. Let me see. So this first one is from Susan, and it's about some content in Year of Wonders, the book. So Susan's wondering, why do you think the villagers turned so viciously on the healers when they had always relied on them for treatments and herbal remedies before the plague? What do you think? Why did that happen? Why did they turn on them?
Well, I was basing that on some actual accounts of things that had happened. I'm sorry. Very bad dog. Bad dog. Come here. I just have to introduce you to my dog. Come on, if you're gonna. I'm gonna put it back. don't ask to come back in. Well, one of my COVID pleasures are the little videos of Olive and Mabel, and I have Olive and Mabel's soul sister here. So anyway, sorry, distracted. Could you just remind me what the question was?
Yeah, it was about why the villagers turned on the
turn?
healers, do you think?
Okay, yes. So that was from factual records of things that had happened elsewhere, where crops failed or where there are a lot of stillbirths. People would turn on the healers and blame them, and there was a tremendous willingness to do this, that people who have the power to heal, because of this lingering superstition, also thought to be perhaps standing against God's will. That was one particular school of thought, that if you're sick, you're meant to be sick and you're meant to suffer, so it's an ungodly thing to ameliorate that. And so when things were going wrong, unfortunately, it was an impulse, and it was often enacted because the women who did this kind of work were often not very powerful people within the social structure. They didn't have a lot of protectors, and so it's basically based on that.
We have some questions about historical fiction in general. So this is a question from Corey, who is curious what you think about what other historical fiction writers might get wrong when crafting a piece of historical fiction. And do you think that like writers of historical fiction are maybe held to a different standard than writers of fiction more generally? Is there something specific to historical fiction that requires more finesse because historical writers are dealing with real figures or real situations that actually occurred?
Well, I think I think that historical fiction spans a wide waterfront, everything from absolute work of art like Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy, which is just literature, really. I mean, it doesn't have to be pigeonholed. It's just literature with a historical theme. And that's also true of other favorite historical works of mine, like Cold Mountain by Charles Frazier, a less well-known but absolutely brilliant work of historical fiction, I Should Be Extremely Happy in Your Company by Brian Hall, which is about the Lewis and Clark expedition. I could go on, there's so many excellent works where the literary merit is, what distinguishes the book. That it has a historical theme is almost a secondary matter. For me, it is just being intrigued by, as I said, these improbable stories from the past, the improbability of a rural village deciding to quarantine. Interesting because it happened, and intriguing. And so I want to know more about it, and I hope readers will want to know more about it too. But then there's a whole other collection of historical fiction that it's more like a romance set in a historical period because the clothing is more interesting, and those books are probably of less interest to me. But in terms of what historical novelists get wrong, I think the thing that annoys me the most is not paying attention to the particularities of the language of the time. And it's not like you can write a whole book in Derbyshire dialect. If I had written Year of Wonders completely in Derbyshire dialect, it would have been too tiring for anybody to read it. But to be particular about trying to use at least some of the language that your character would have used, and to go to a bit of trouble, like if you want to talk about a fetus, I'm pretty sure in 1660, she's not using the word fetus. So you go and do some research and you find out that the word she would have used is shapeling. And I think that the right word can give you a sense of time travel quicker than almost anything else that a novelist can do.
That's great. That's really interesting. I have a follow-up question based on, or it's sort of about process, which it sounds like writing historical fiction is going to involve doing a lot. You were just mentioning a bunch of research, and that's like maybe a different part of a unique aspect of writing historical fiction that doesn't attach to writing other bits of fiction. I mean, you might do research for other kinds of fiction as well, but
that's true. I just had to research extensively vertebrate osteology for a contemporary character that I was writing. So yeah, I think if you're any good at your job, you're gonna want that scaffolding to be right, because if you don't get the scaffolding right, you can't build the fantastically elaborate imaginative edifice on top of it.
Here's a question from Parker that's about again about the A Year of Wonders. So in the book, one of the rich families leaves town. They break the quarantine compact. And the question is, do you think that cultural, political, and religious homogeneity partially explains the remarkable solidarity of the villagers?
Oh, that's a very interesting point. I hadn't really dwelt on that too much. It was actually true that the one family of great means left the village and did not submit to the quarantine. So, and then I got some mail from the descendants of that family subsequently saying they were planning on moving anyway. It had nothing to do with the plague. And I thought, well, you keep telling yourself that about great great grandpa. You go. But that's a very interesting point about solidarity, and probably so. Probably so. I think it's possibly easier to get a consensus among people who share values and belief system, and could be, yes.
So maybe following up on the homogeneity point, Jane has a question about trust. So trust seems to be something that might be very important in surviving a plague. And how do you think people come to trust each other when everyone is a potential source of contagion, and so is like it's maybe risky to be around people? And then the question is like, how does this theme of needing trust but also being reluctant to trust one another in a case of a plague play out in your novel?
Yeah, no, I don't think you could possibly. I mean, you'd be an idiot because it's not in anyone's control. So, one of the things that I used as a yardstick when writing this novel was experiences as a foreign correspondent, seeing people in times of crisis. And it wasn't plague, but I'd covered famines and I'd covered wars and uprisings. And, the interesting thing is people respond very differently to crisis. Some people are drawn towards their best self, and they find that within them there's a level of courage and self-sacrifice that they weren't even aware that they had, and might have gone through their whole life not knowing they had if they hadn't been tested by this crisis. And then other people are drawn to their absolute worst self, and they become abusers and people who tread on the faces of their neighbors in order to rise themselves. And I don't think you can ever really know for sure which you are until you are put into that crucible. And so I thought about actual living examples that I'd seen of, what happened to boy soldiers in wars, or what happened to people who fell into the bureaucracy of torture in Iraq. And then I thought about women who changed an enormous amount, women who had been led to believe that their entire life would be completely domestic, suddenly had to lead their families or their communities because all the men were gone to fight or had been arrested, or some other catastrophe had overtaken their community. And I saw women change incredibly as a result of the roles that they had to play. So that emboldened me to write my characters as people who could change and people who could be affected either in a negative or a positive way by the test of the plague.
I have a question. This one's about historical fiction more generally, or about your sort of writing process with that. And the question's from Brandon, and it's about how you get in the minds of the characters. So you can do research about the historical time period, but the getting, you don't have direct access to necessarily to the minds of the characters. And Brandon is wondering if, the general question is, how do you get into the minds of your characters? And then more particularly, do you think that even though the novels are set in the distant past where people were maybe very different from us, do you think it's important to focus on sort of universal human emotions and experiences? Or do you think maybe there aren't these universal human emotions, experiences that transcend time?
Yeah, no, as I was saying before, I do, and I lean heavily into my own emotional responses and experiences in creating my characters' emotional lives. For example, Anna loses both her children early in the book, and that was incredibly painful to write. I had a young child at the time, and every description of her two boys is actually a description of my own son and things that I had observed as he, grew from infant to toddler. And so you dig into this stuff. You dig into the stuff that you've got, and and certainly from being a foreign correspondent again, people would tell me that an X group was different to Y group. So I'd hear this in lots of different contexts, white Africans saying it about Black Africans and vice versa, Palestinians about Israelis and vice versa. They're not like us, they don't think the same. But when you would be at a funeral or sitting with a grieving mother, the emotion was exactly the same, whether you were in a refugee camp or whether you were in a modern, well-appointed drawing room. The sound of a mother's crying is exactly the same sound in both places. So, I think that this idea that people are more different than they are alike at the most basic and important level is absolutely a myth. Certainly my experience has tended to lead me to believe that.
Another question about sort of writing process is, do you see your work as, in some sense, a commentary on the present? Is it more, do you think historical fiction is more rooted in the era that it's set or in the era that it's written?
I don't think of it as a commentary on the present. Oh, well, I'm gonna retract that, because the book I'm just finishing now is very much a dialogue between the past and the present, and particularly on the subject of race, and how much has really changed or not changed. So, but generally not. Generally, I don't. Generally, I want to be immersed in the thinking and the belief system of the period that I'm working in. And particularly, I think particularly for somebody like me who's pretty largely a secular person, even though I'm very interested in belief, to put yourself in the mindset of people who were so steeped in religious belief and for whom it was a defining factor in their every waking moment. And it's been helpful to live in some societies where that's still true, like staying with an ultra-Orthodox Jewish family, or in certain Muslim communities where the day is really defined by your relationship with God, much more than anything else that happens.
So we have a question from Jeff, who loved the observation that you made earlier, that grief and joy sort of travel together in tandem. And Jeff is wondering if you think that we might have a responsibility to salvage or savor joy, just in this, like in the same way that we might have a responsibility to address grief and suffering.
Absolutely. I mean, it's entirely necessary for us as we fight our way out of this time. And I think it's been amazing how people have found a way to share art and music. Some of the really beautiful musical performances that people have managed to put together, they're going to stay with me forever. That the opera singer in the Milan Cathedral at Christmas time, absolutely stunning. The totally empty city of Milan that's usually so teeming with people. The English churches putting together that incredibly joyful hymn. So many examples of that. And yes, we are a species that seeks joy, even in the worst times, and thank goodness for that.
So now moving on to a less uplifting question. How do you think the pandemic might affect younger generations going forward? So do you think that the lack of socialization or social distancing, masks, online learning, et cetera, might have a significant impact, especially on children? This is a question from Riley.
Yeah, well, I've got a high school student of my own, and I can happily report that you can't keep a social kid down. I mean, at least not around here. I had to practically tie him to the bedpost to stop him socializing, and they found a way out in the freezing cold, keeping their distance, going on long walks all through the winter. What I'm concerned about the massive educational loss for people who didn't have resources, who didn't have parents who could be at home with them supervising their learning, particularly the younger kids. I've got a niece who's doing Teach for America in a disadvantaged school in New Orleans. And, for several months, she lost track of half her kiddos. They were little kids, they were 5 and 6 year olds. They can't do Zoom, So they've really lost a year of education. And then for some of the older kids at the high school here where I live, there are a lot of kids who hate school in the best of times and feel alienated from it. And they're lost. I'm sure that when we do an accounting of the dropout rate and failure to graduate, we're going to see a horrific toll educationally from this thing.
This is a question from Aaron, which is about trauma. It makes the question makes a distinction between different ways that communities can deal with trauma. So one is like an individualistic way where individuals are supposed to just deal with the trauma on their own, and another is sort of in cases of collective trauma, where the trauma is a collective experience and arguably an easier one to deal with because collectively we're all dealing with it. And Aaron is wondering, in your research, did you find that the subjects of the village collectively grieved through their trauma, or was it a more individualistic process? And do you think that their grieving process produced more or less sort of resilience among the people?
I hate to tell you this, but the news is bad from Eam. The village did not recover for another 50 or so years after the plague. The devastation of so much concentrated loss when the epidemic burned itself out, people turned on each other. The minister who'd led the village all through the thing had to leave, and he wasn't welcomed anywhere else either. People blamed him for the death toll. It's a really tragic story, which is one of the reasons my novel ends the way it does. And I've taken a fair amount of grief for the ending because people think it's implausible. but I could not leave my protagonist there because I knew what was coming and I didn't want to leave her there to deal with all that. So I wanted to get her away, and I wanted to get her somewhere different, and I wanted to send her somewhere loud and noisy and bright. And so I did research travels of solo women in that period, and I found some amazing stories. My favorite one I did not use was about a Quaker woman who had been flogged for her beliefs in England, and she just conceived the idea that her mission in life was to convert the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and so she traveled to Turkey and managed to get an audience with the Sultan, which nobody did. You know, usually you got to see the vizier, so she got to sit down with the Sultan. And then she went on from there to sail to Charleston and had about 6 kids. And you can find a little plaque on it. Unfortunately, it's a parking lot now, but saying that this was the home of that woman. So that was fascinating. So it was possible for women to do these things, but I took as the model for what happens to Anna, the story of what happened to 2 Irish midwives who were heading for America, but their ship was waylaid by Barbary pirates and they're about to be sold into chattel slavery. And instead, their incredible skills as midwives and healers led them to become highly valued and respected members of that community. So I thought that'll do. I'll send her there.
So I have another question about process, which is just when you're in the middle of researching or writing the book, what's an average day, or what's your sort of schedule like? This is a question from Colleen, maybe an aspiring novelist among us, who's curious what is your average day when writing a novel like?
So a good average day, what used to be my day, was the school bus would come and collect the kid, and I would go right to my study and open a book of poetry at a random page and read a poem just to kind of flex the muscles that deal with language. And I would sit there until that school bus came back. And that was my working day. And that worked really well for me because there was a limit. I knew there was a limit. And I'd get up. Not that as the kids got older, they needed me hovering over them, but I like to be around and available because the older the kids get, as anyone who's got adolescents knows, they're not going to talk to you on your schedule. They'll talk when they feel like it. So it's just good to be lurking. And so while I was lurking and making dinner or gardening or something, the ideas for the novel would keep working away in my brain, and I'd have something to do the next day when I sat down. And it's not like you can write good stuff every day. You can't. A friend of mine, but you can write something. And I think that that's important. A friend of mine's a sculptor, and somebody asked her about her process, and she said, my process is mess, 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 art. And I love that because you can't make art every day, but you can make a mess every day. And so that's my day. I sit and I make a mess in writing, and then at least I've got something to work with.
Well, Geraldine, thank you so much. I'm going to pass things back to Simone.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelist, Geraldine Brooks, who's very kind to give us some of her time. A fantastic discussion, and I'm sure we'd all be applauding if we weren't in this horrible virtual space. So thank you very much, Geraldine. We really appreciate it.